Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you all for taking the time and being with us virtually. My name is John Charback, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Law and Justice Studies here at Rowan University. And I'm excited to welcome you to today's speaker series event titled Domestic Terrorism and Far-Right Extremism in America Through the Lens of the January 6th Capitol Insurrection. We're pleased to be joined by two scholars who are at the cutting edge of this area of research, Dr. Stephen Windisch and Dr. Erin Carnes, who will be making some presentations, and we're very much looking forward to their talks. Just a few introductory remarks before we get started. We seem to have a problematic history of domestic terrorism in America, from the rise of the KKK and the use of racialized violence and lynchings to high-profile incidents such as the Oklahoma City bombing and the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. But no event has propelled the phenomenon of domestic terrorism and far-right extremism into the national consciousness and spotlight like that of the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol. Following the Stop the Steal rally, thousands descended on the U.S. Capitol building, which was breached and vandalized. 140 police officers were injured from assaults, ironically from crowds that waved Blue Lives Matter flags. We saw images and videos of the Confederate flag inside the building, as well as anti-government and anti-Semitic clothing being worn by some of the participants. QAnon, the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, if they weren't known before, are now household names. And I've seen more QAnon documentaries over the last few months than I'd care to admit. The connection between far-right extremism and the military and law enforcement is also deeply concerning and worthy of more of our attention. As of last week, according to reporting from ABC News, at least 52 active or retired military, law enforcement, or government services members were among the more than 430 arrested for their actions during the January 6th attack on the Capitol. A report from Georgetown's Project on Extremism found military members who participated in the attack on the Capitol were 4 times more likely to be involved in domestic extremist organizations such as the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers. Of those 43 arrested with military backgrounds, more than 1/3 of them were affiliated with some type of violent extremist organization. Following these events, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin issued a military-wide stand-down order and established the Countering Extremism Working Group to examine the size and scope of the problem in the entire military. The DoD is now reviewing and potentially updating its definition of extremism while reviewing screening protocols for those seeking entry into the military. Perhaps January 6th was a wake-up call, not only to our government, the intelligence and law enforcement communities, but to media and journalists reporting on the topic, as well as ordinary American citizens. With that said, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Stephen Windisch. Dr. Windisch is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at Temple University. He has published widely on the issue of political violence, radicalization, and disengagement. As a collective, his research investigates the overlap between conventional criminal offending and political extremism. Dr. Windisch is particularly interested in how the physical and psychological trauma and interpersonal violence intersect with political violence. His research has received support from the Campbell Collaboration, Department of Homeland Security, National Consortium for the Study of and Responses to Terrorism, or START, and the National Counterterrorism Innovation Technology and Education Center of Excellence. Some of his current research projects include a meta-analysis of online hate speech interventions and an in-depth interviews with political extremists' family members to identify barriers to intervention and official reporting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Windisch.
Thank you very much. First off, I just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to come and speak today. It's been really great to get this research out there. It's come a long way. When I first started in graduate school researching white supremacy and domestic terrorism, some of the notable reactions were, this is lame, or why aren't you studying ISIS? And over the course of 5 or 6 years, we've seen somewhat of a shift towards seeing this as a as the threat that it actually is. A lot of my research focuses on domestic extremism, white supremacy, and I look at that through a symbolic interactionism lens. And January 6th really got me focusing on this to a much greater extent, and how what efforts are the white supremacist movement, the leaders, the members, what have they taken the last, let's say, decade, if we just want to cut it off at a decade, to get us to where we're at to today. And so I think I want to start with a quote. A lot of the data that I use in my own research is life history interviews with former white supremacists. And in 2017, we started interviewing a batch of them across the entire country, along with my colleagues Pete Simi, Kathleen Blee, and Matthew DeMichel. And so looking at this repository, we were able to kind of pull out some current events. And one of the quotes that came out of these interviews is in reaction to Charlottesville. So what Unite the Right rally in 2017. And this participant's a pseudonym. We're going to call him Jason. He said it was crazy to see because a lot of these people, they look like normal citizens, like normal college students, and people you never think are white supremacy. You never think who you were talking to in the world today, because they're all blending in. You don't really see anybody with shaved heads and boots on anymore and stuff like that. It's crazy because you're starting to see what we were preaching come to life. And so Jason was active in the skinhead movement in the early 90s, about 91 to 96. And in this interview, he's talking about in the early 90s, this being the ultimate goal. And you see leaders like Louis Beam, David Duke, Tom Metzger, kind of promoting a similar strategy. One of what we're going to refer to as kind of this front stage presentation. And like I said, a lot of my research pulls from symbolic interactionism. I'm a huge Goffman fan. And I think Goffman's work fits very well with what happened with the January 6th. And so you can see from the previous quote that they are aware of this intentional effort to blend in of sorts, if you will. And so Goffman refers to this as the front stage. The whole world is a stage, right? We're all acting in this. And when we're in formal settings, our front stage self is what we want other people to see. We want them to think of us as respectable and upright and professional. If you're going to go meet, let's say, an in-law, or you're going to interview for a new job, you would present your front stage self. And you can see this woman here. Her house looks very neat and clean, and she's doing an interview, everything that's recommended of her. It's actually funny because this same reporter showed what her actual house looks like behind the camera. And with Zoom and all the online teaching that we've all done today, we can all connect with this, that what you see on the camera is just what I want you to see, or what I put on Instagram or Facebook is just what I want you to see, but there's a whole nother self to me that's behind the camera. And that's what we refer to as our backstage self, or our backstage behavior. These are more informal, these are more relaxed, kind of go with the flow, if you will. And there's not these internalized norms and expectations that you would see in the front stage self. So the white supremacist movement has recognized this, right? They've recognized this as early as the 90s, right? They said, hey, we have this issue that we are viewed as the Klan. We're viewed as running around in torches with hoods on, being destructive, and that's not good for our image. We need to change the model. And this is an active, intentional effort to blend in, and Don here illustrates this perfectly. He says, these swastika-toting idiots ruin everything. These guys are dressing up with their heads shaved, their flak jackets, and their combat boots, and they're causing trouble. And that's not the way you think you make things move. You guys are just going around picking on people. When a middle-class worker reads that skinheads cause this kind of trouble, they're not going to join. They'll link white power to white supremacy. We need to get people working in the infrastructure of this country in our group. We need to get the judges. We need to get the cops in our group. We need to get people of standing, right? And so this is, he's being interviewed in 2017, but he's referencing this back as early as the 90s, that we need to do away with what's referred to as movement-centric activities. Less marches, less political protests, less outward appearances. Instead, it's kind of a tactical retreat. Develop your communities, develop your safe spaces, develop your collective identity, focus on the family, focus on the home, extend that to the church. Online is going to be a huge process of this, but let's not bring unnecessary heat to us from law enforcement or the social stigma that accompanies white supremacy. If you look at a lot of the protests, Charlottesville, with the Unite Right rally is a great example of that. A lot of people showed up from the far right, but there were just as many, if not more, counter protesters there at these events. And so let's do away with those old ways of thinking. Let's kind of retreat into the shadows. Let's refer to this as white collar supremacy and work the system from the inside. So we see this happening over the last 10 to 20 years, and it really starts to culminate in the early 2016, 2017 era. And what we refer to this as impression management, or in the organizational literature, rebranding. And in the wake of the last 18 months or so, we've actually seen prominent companies rebrand. Uncle Ben's, Aunt Jemima, they've looked at their past and said, hey, a lot of our imagery and a lot of our branding is actually connected to racist past. And that's not something that we want our brand to be associated with. So they're in the process of rebranding these logos for the betterment of it. I think this is a good example of kind of rebranding acts is taking place everywhere. But I think a better illustration of how rebranding applies to the far right is if we look at Miley Cyrus. So Miley Cyrus started out as Hannah Montana. She had a very small base, 9, 10-year-old girls. And as a performer, she said, hey, what can I do to expand my base, to cast a wider net? Oh, I'll rebrand myself into Miley. So she went from Hannah Montana to Miley. She's on the level of Beyonce and Cher and Madonna, where she's just a one-person name. You know who Miley is. And because of this, she's now selling records not only to 9 to 10-year-old little girls, but also to teenagers, to young adults, to adults. And that allows her brand to expand to people that she normally would not have been able to capture. The far right's doing the same thing. And if we look from the 90s into the early 2000s, they've rebranded their image. They've changed their front stage behavior. This used to be their front stage. Tom Metzger and War, Aryan Nations, Hammerskins, the Klan, this is what you got. You got the skulls, you got the hammers, and you knew what you were stepping into. Today, it looks a lot different. Their imagery, their front stage has morphed. It's evolved. The alt-right, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters. The symbol on the bottom left used to be the Identity Europa. They've since disbanded, I think, in 2019. But you can see that the images are totally different. A lot less reds, no skulls, no weapons. It's a very benign, kind of blend-in logo. If your parent were walking behind you, you wouldn't give this a second thought. You're thinking, oh, it's a rooster. Why would I be concerned about what my child is reading with that propaganda? Same thing with just the other aspects of their frontward appearance. So there's still a collective performance and there's a collective identity here. But instead of having this very stigmatizing imagery of a Klan and burning crosses, now they're emphasizing health, nutrition, a lot of MMA fighting. If you look on YouTube, you can see RAM and some of these other groups, a lot of MMA fighting. They really emphasize that your body's a vessel and that you need to take care of it. And you should do that through exercise and nutrition and fitness. And so the kind of initial captivating aspect of this is one of like benevolence. So we're in this for, kind of a fraternity of sorts. We're not in this for hate. We're in this for love. We're in this for our own self-preservation. We see an evolution or a rebranding of sorts in terms of their media. Tom Metzger used to have a TV show that he would advertise. A lot of members in the early 90s had answering machines. So you'd call in the phone number, you get an answer machine, and they would give you a speech or a sermon about racial purity or protecting the white race. Today, you can log on to a number of different media sites like Facebook and Instagram, as well as Gab, 4chan, 8chan that are directed towards that. But you don't have to call. It's at a click of your finger. It's on your cell phone all the time, 24 hours a day. And the information is cloaked. It's kind of the misinformation. The ways that it's advertised is not, hey, I called Tom Metzger today to get my my daily dose. It's, hey, I read a story on Twitter today, and so it's a little bit harder to see the propaganda that's laced within it. QAnon. So it's interesting that we've already talked about QAnon briefly, but QAnon is the conspiracy theory to end all theories, right? It's essentially this, like, it contains all of the theories within its oneself. And I've heard it recently described as kind of like an open world experience where any person who's a QAnon supporter can take elements of the JFK assassination. They can take elements of Watergate. They can take elements of Area 51, and they can kind of create their own conspiracy, and they can go down whatever path they want. And that's both the beauty and the danger of QAnon, is that it's so widespread, that it captures so many people, and that it's so multifaceted that an individual can just continuously redistort their reality based on these different escape hatches that the various theories contain. And QAnon is kind of this rebranded version. What used to be Zog, or the Zionist occupied government, that had these kind of anti-Semitic connotations to it right off the front in the title of it, QAnon is a little bit more benign. It's a little bit more cloaked, but it still contains those same racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic conspiracies that we've had around forever. And then lastly, the recruitment of it. So recruitment used to be, here's a CD, here's a tape, here's a video game, very informal, person to person. But now they've kind of gotten very clever about it, and so within the chat rooms of, let's say, Assassin's Creed or, Skyrim, that the storyline is one of Aryan white pride, Aryan lineage. They kind of use that as a foot in the door technique, and so we've seen all of this occur over the last 20 or 30 years, this progression from the fringe to more mainstream issues, with the intention of changing that front stage image, right? This is all about casting a wider net. This is all about attracting new members. This is all about projecting an image that they want to control, that is not my grandpa's clan, but is a new Western embrace of white values, right? And it works, right? It is working, and it has worked. We've seen this where if you look at the Southern Poverty Law Center, they are tracking hate groups. I think they're like 830 this year, which is down from about 1,000 in 2018. So in terms of official group size, we have seen a decline, but I don't think that there's any doubt that the sprawl of white supremacy extends beyond what the Southern Poverty Law Center has established as a hate group, right? What is a hate group? Is it one person? Is it two people? Do you have to meet? Do you have to be in physical proximity? There's a lot of issues with identifying what a hate group is. So I think looking at more of the sprawl and looking at the collective identity that extends as opposed to the formal membership is what's important. And you can see, whether it's what happened in Charlottesville in 2017 or recently in 2021, there is a wide population of supporters there, from women to men, from old people to young people, those that are interested in politics, those that have no background in politics. And it's because of the propaganda. It's because of the misinformation that is being projected here. And Gavin McInnes is a really great example, as well as Richard Spencer, that they project this front stage of, we are about entrepreneurship, we're about Western values, we're about protecting the border and being anti-politically correct and common sense. But their backstage is one of hatred, of violence, misogyny, anti-Semitism. Gavin wrote a list, 10 reasons why I hate Jews. He is very misogynistic and making suggestions that women would be happier at home as opposed to pursuing professional careers. And then just general racist and bigotry statements that Muslims are stupid. And these are leaders in the far right currently, right now. Spencer's same way. He supports abortion, but only because he thinks that it would benefit the white race. He promotes racial hierarchy. This is a very interesting technique. Essentially, Spencer got this from Jared Taylor, and their position is there is a racial hierarchy, and at the top of this racial hierarchy are Asians. Right below them are whites, and then way below them is everybody else. So I can't be racist since I am claiming that whites are second to Asians. a lot of wordsmith, it's a lot of malarkey, but essentially they are advertising and promoting this idea that whites are number two, but whites are way better than everybody else. And so this removes them from any labels of being a white supremacist. But if we, again, can peel behind the curtain here, we can see that a lot of what Richard is saying, though, is very racist and is very misogynistic, one of which is saying that segregation should be an ideal. And he's actually went so far to outline his new ethno-state, where you'd have the United States carved into these different aspects of a white country, a black country, and then you'd have these multicultural districts like Texas, Cascadia. These would be allowed to have diversity, but everybody would be encouraged to live in the part of the United States that adheres with their own racial makeup. And so the whole purpose of this is that the front stage can be, we're all about Western ideals and European history, and we're not about hate, we're about love, but just take a little bit of effort and you can see that the backstage performance of them is very much one of racism, anti-Semitism, and homophobia, all of which are the bread and butter of white supremacy. So this is a veneer. This whole new, we're white nationalists, we're not white supremacists. That is an intentional effort to rebrand and to change their movement's history to be one that is favorable and is one that's going to increase recruitment. And you can see that the propaganda here is at its all-time peak, right? So in addition to them having this less movement-centric activities like marches and demonstrations and protests, they've shifted that energy to online. And so we're seeing a lot of propaganda. Could be anything from memes and like little tweets about, take back our future. Could be something violent, promoting violence against Antifa. The image there on the far right is it's a hunting permit to go and essentially kill Antifa members. Recruitment flyers for joining the Proud Boys, and then obviously making fun of comments that were made in 2016 and kind of leveraging that to fit their narrative and kind of embolden their beliefs or sorts. And it also could be humor. Humor is an extremely effective form. We see this a lot on 4chan, a lot on 8chan, a lot of irony, a lot of sarcasm, and humor is one of those effective techniques that the teller can always say, well, I was just joking. I didn't mean that, or don't take it so sensitive. And so the person who's offended in the joke automatically has to justify why they were offended, whereas the joke teller who made the racist comment can kind of brush it off and minimize it and say, well, I wasn't being serious. All the while, this is still, disseminating, transmitting, recycling violence, and essentially getting at their core values, which is what they want, subjugation of minorities and non-whites. And so how does this help? So we've looked at front stage, we looked at backstage. Why would I use this to describe what happened on January 6th? Well, we could look at January 6th and we could say, hey, this reflects essentially a breakdown in front stage behavior. Since the early 90s, the far right has said, hey, let's have less activity in public, let's have more activity online and kind of behind closed doors, let's build up our ranks, and let's go through these motions because it's working and it's recruiting a lot of people. What Mead would say in this discussion of Goffman's front stage is that you can only perform your front stage in situations that you're aware of, that you've been in before. And because a lot of these participants that were there on January 6th had never been in that situation before, they broke their front stage behavior. And they reverted to their backstage, which we've discussed is one of violence and aggression and misogyny and fear and anger. And so in that moment, you could look at Philip Zimbardo's work, Power of the Situation. Maybe the power of the situation on January 6th allowed them to revert back to their backstage behavior and the violence pursued. It's very possible. What I think is a little bit more probably likely is leading up to January 6th, year 2, 3, 4 years in advance, back to 2016, you could see an emboldenment of explicit racism. Trump and other political figures, are referring to Mexican and South American countries as an infestation, an immigration. There's a white genocide taking over. The days leading up, the hours and minutes leading up to the riots, that they're being stolen, their country's being stolen, that you got to fight back. We need battle by combat, or trial by combat, I think is the actual phrase. And then again, just throughout his entire presidency in that administration, we saw the Muslim ban. We saw, Haitian, El Salvador countries referred to as shitholes. There was a lot of rhetoric that emboldened this kind of behavior. The famous stand back and stand by. That kind of thing, essentially, it internalizes this front stage behavior. And so that's what Goffman's argument is that front stage behavior are these internalized norms and expectations. You open up a door, you stand in line, you shake somebody's hand. Well, over the course of 4 or 5 years of hearing the Trump administration and his allies breed this anti-Semitism, this racism, and this bigotry, it's possible that these individuals now see that as their front stage behavior, that they've gotten away with it, that it's been accepted, and that there's a lot of support behind it, that this backstage that they could only talk about in chat rooms or amongst themselves, now in that moment became their front stage, that we either need to, we need to either fight or lay down. And so for a lot of these individuals, that front stage became their backstage became their front stage, and they kind of replaced that. And as a result, you see a lot of violence. And so the takeaways that we need to see from this are the white supremacist movement is not a new wave. It's not a new iteration. It's not something that never existed before. This is the old guard rebranded. This is the old guard being conscientious of oppression management, and that they know that their success in the future is based on recruitment, is based on funding. And the way to do that is to project a front stage that does not reek swastikas and KKK and burning crosses and tiki torches and stuff like that, but one that embraces, we are white Americans worried about the white race, protecting Western values. And we should not be duped or deceived by this, that behind all of those front stage images are the same old bread and butter racism, hatred, bigotry, and anti-Semitism that the white supremacist movement has always had. And so as we continue to dive into this aspect more, one of the things that we want to look at are the different variations within the movement. And you might have a population of the white supremacist movement that is very conformist and wants to pursue this mainstreaming, where you might have segments of the far right that are all about direct action and attacks and violence. And they think that, the system isn't moving quick enough, and now we need to have this action, especially in the face of defeat, which is what they're viewing this as, that, this is a temporary setback. We need to kind of retool. And as we come back, we're going to come back stronger. So we'll definitely want to continue to track this and kind of see how that front stage evolves and how some of these backstage aspects start to seep into the front stage identity. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Stephen, for that presentation. Really interesting stuff. We're going to reserve questions until the end, but I encourage those of you who do have questions to type them into the chat box. Our next speaker is Dr. Erin Carnes. Erin is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Alabama. Starting in August of this year, she will join the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice and the National Counterterrorism Innovation Technology and Education Center of Excellence at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Her primary research seeks to understand the relationship among terrorism, media, law enforcement, and the public. Her publications include articles on why groups lie about terrorism, media coverage of terrorism and counterterrorism, public perceptions of terrorism and counterterrorism practices, and the relationships between communities and law enforcement. Her work has been funded through a number of sources, including the National Consortium for the Study of and Responses to Terrorism, or START, and featured on numerous media outlets including CNN, The Economist, NPR, The Washington Post, and Vox. She serves on the editorial boards of Criminal Justice and Behavior, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, and Dynamics of Asymmetric Conflict, and has served as a consultant for the Police Foundation and the Department of Justice's Office of Community-Oriented Policing. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carnes.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here today. Stephen, would you mind passing back the presenter thing so I can share my slides? So in the meantime, so what I'm going to be talking about today actually really dovetails quite well, I think, with what Dr. Windich just spoke about. Let me see if I can get this full screen so it's not quite as odd. And focusing really on less about the phenomenon itself, right? So Dr. Windich has gone into great detail talking about how far-right groups have evolved and become more mainstream in the last few decades. One of the things that is difficult in public understanding of this is that it doesn't really jive with what most people think of as terrorism or extremism in the United States. And this is some of the research that I do, is just looking at these misunderstandings about terrorism, where they might come from, and how we can potentially correct them. So I assume that everyone on this call is or has taken some criminology, criminal justice classes. And we've all had, I assume, the experience of a loved one, family member, friend talking about something related to crime and crime control that they saw on television. And they're insistent that, criminal minds is really how things, happen, just like that. And as people who study these issues, we're like, yeah, no, that's not quite it. But the general public tends to get their information about crime generally from media, from entertainment media, from news media. And that's not always a real reflection of the actual phenomenon. And this can lead to misperceptions that have ripple consequences. And it's particularly challenging when one of the largest threats in the United States is from far-right extremism, and it's not what we see typically on television, and it's more mainstream in the ways that Dr. Windich has just discussed. So the problem that I'm going to be talking about today is really about these misunderstandings about what terrorism is and who perpetrates it amongst the public. And this matters for a number of, This matters for a number of reasons. First of all, it limits public understanding and awareness of what extremism is and what the threats are from extremism. This can hinder our ability to identify potentially suspicious activity, can hinder the ability of members of the public to recognize that there are suspicious behaviors that somebody might be engaged, as Dr. Windich said, that you're not going to necessarily see a Proud Boys logo and click, oh, that's potentially problematic. So it can hinder the public ability to recognize these threats, and can also influence policy preferences and how we collectively as society respond to threats. And this is something that particularly January 6th and some of the discussions around that really, can really sort of flesh out some of the complexities in public response and the debates surrounding that. So a couple questions I'm going to talk about today. I want to talk a little bit about media representations and then talk about public perceptions of this, deriving from some of my own research. Though certainly I'm not the only person who's studying this. So when we look at media representations broadly, there's been plenty of work that's already been done by Jack Shaheen and others looking at entertainment media depictions of terrorist threats. And overwhelmingly in TV shows, movies, terrorist threats are depicted as, the perpetrators are depicted as generally Middle Eastern, Arab, or Muslim, clearly part of a quote unquote other group from a social identity perspective. So the notion that, the perpetrators, the threats are coming from some group external to us as Americans, particularly as white Christian majorities in the country, the threats from terrorism aren't coming from the in-group, they're coming from the out-group. When we look at this in terms of news media, these are some of the questions that have been part of public discourse and debate, particularly in the last 5-6 years. You've probably seen the gif of Peter Griffin from Family Guy holding up what colors the perpetrator's skin, and whether we call this attack terrorism or a function of mental illness. And these are things that permeate public discourse, but we need to really understand what these mechanisms look like and then how this might be influencing the way that people understand and misunderstand terrorism, and then what we can potentially do to try to correct that. So why does media coverage matter in the first place? So news media in particular have two main functions in society. First, they agenda set, meaning that what news media covers is what the public is aware of. This signals that particular topics or events are important because they are being covered in news media, period. And when things are not covered in news media, the public tend to be less aware of them or think that those things are less important, even if they might be aware that they're happening. Once there is coverage of particular events, in this case, terrorist attacks, it also matters how that coverage is being framed. Is it being framed as terrorism, as something else, as protest? How these issues are framed can also influence how the public understands and discusses these topics. And this is, particularly we think about things like the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville that Dr. Charbak had referenced. The ways that was framed in media at the time tended to be sort of downplaying some of this extremist rhetoric, not calling it, potential terrorism threat then, and seeing how those framing impacts might also influence public perceptions. So just a quick note on what the methods are behind this, because we think about this discussion, this assumption that if the perpetrator is Muslim, it's called terrorism. If the perpetrator is white, it's not called terrorism, and it's instead discussed as reference to mental illness. And we think about this most saliently perhaps with Dylan Roof and his attack in Charleston in 2015. By any definition of terrorism, it is clear that that attack falls within that. It is clear that he perpetrated an act of terrorism. But at the time, there was this pretty vigorous debate in media of, do we refer to this as terrorism, or do we talk about his mental health? And so the consensus seemed to be to not call it terrorism, which is really problematic when we think about actual understandings of these events and the fact these two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. The perpetrator can potentially have a mental health issue and perpetrate terrorism. That's not to say that one is causing the other, but just understanding that there's more complexity to this than the public narrative typically likes to, that is common sort of public understanding. So I don't want to go too far into the details, but I do want to tell you sort of what we did to actually systematically look at how media cover terrorism and how there might be biases in what is covered and how it's covered that can help us understand why the public has pretty large misinterpretations of the terrorism threats. So what we did for this study is we looked at 10 years of terrorist attacks in the Global Terrorism Database. For those of you who've taken Dr. Lewandowski's class, you're probably familiar with this database. For the rest of you, it is a publicly available data set of all terrorist attacks really around the world, but we restricted just to the US from 1970 to, I think, last year. And there's issues with any database, there's issues with this, but it does provide us with this systematic set of cases to look at. So there were 136 attacks in the US during this 10-year period. And then to look at media coverage, we pulled print media coverage from LexisNexis Academic and CNN.com of those 136 attacks. In total, we had 3,541 news articles of 100 attacks, which means that 36 of those attacks didn't receive any news coverage in the sources that we were pulling. So thinking about this is roughly a quarter of the terrorist attacks in the US during this 10-year period didn't receive much media coverage at all, which is part of that agenda-setting piece. We then looked at various different factors about these attacks, who perpetrated them, how many people were killed, et cetera, to understand why some attacks get more coverage, how attacks are framed, and then leading to further research on how this might be influencing people's perceptions. So first, looking just at the number of articles that attacks receive, what we found is when the perpetrator is Muslim, attacks receive dramatically more coverage. So about 350% more coverage when the perpetrator is Muslim. Other factors matter too, whether or not the perpetrator is arrested, whether or not the target was law enforcement or government, the number of people killed. So there are other sort of incident level factors that influence how much coverage a terrorist attack receives. But really, one of the main driving parts of misperceptions and this association that people tend to have between terrorism, extremism, and Islam, which hinders our ability to think about other threats as well, is the amount of media coverage that these attacks receive is just outsized, which suggests to the public that they are the predominant terrorism threat, which is not the case in the data. And it makes these associations stronger for the public, which has really problematic downstream implications. So then once we look at the coverage that actually exists, is it framed as terrorism or not? And we again see that when the perpetrator is Muslim, it's about a 500% more likely or 5 times more likely to reference that attack or label that attack as being terrorism. So not only is there dramatically more coverage of attacks with Muslim perpetrators, but that coverage is far more likely to frame the attack as terrorism as compared to non-Muslim perpetrators. So this is, again, really hindering the public ability to understand everything that Dr. Windich just talked about, because that's not how we collectively associate what terrorism, extremism threats are in the United States. We look then also at whether or not the attack is framed as being a result of mental illness. We actually didn't see support at all for the general assumption that when the perpetrator is white, it's more likely to be framed as mental illness. And this is just, I think, interesting in, we partially confirm this conventional wisdom, so to speak, and partially we don't find support for it in our data. So this is, sort of a little bit ancillary to the main point of what I'm talking about today, but I did want to show this because it is, something that we had expected to see and didn't. So why does this matter, right? So the way that media cover events connects potentially to public views on terrorism. The way that, there's other factors that also can influence how people are viewing attacks. And one of the things that is, I think most frustrating for those of us who study terrorism, much like it is for everyone, all of us as criminologists, is that it's hard to change people's minds. People tend to have large misperceptions about what terrorism is, and trying to get people to update their views to be more in line with data is incredibly difficult. And this can have, these biases and perceptions can really have they can have detrimental impacts really in the actual, prevention efforts, trying to prevent terrorism and targeted violence. So looking a little bit at some of the attempts that my colleagues and I have made at trying to understand these, and I will say the findings aren't particularly encouraging thus far, but it is really opening up future avenues of research and things that we don't yet know, and trying to really understand where people's misperceptions come from and how we can correct them. And one of the most common cited statistics here is that in public opinion polling, about half of US adults are afraid that they or someone they love will be the victim of a terrorist attack. When we look at the actual risks of that, you are more likely to die doing basically anything else in the world, in the US at least. You are more likely to, you're more likely, I think it's like shark bites and like getting tangled in your bed sheets and crazy things like this. But that's not the public perception of it. And so sort of the way that we've oriented some of our responses to it is far outsized to the actual threat and misunderstanding of where the threats are actually coming from in a more holistic way. So one of the studies that a colleague and I did on this was looking at the Las Vegas shooting in particular. So if you recall, this attack occurred in October of 2017. The perpetrator it was a white man who, according to the Global Terrorism Database, is coded. This event is coded in this data set due to some linkage between the perpetrator and a far-right group. This is an incident that is, those of us who study terrorism pretty vigorously debate whether or not this really fits the bill as terrorism or not, whether the strength of that evidence of whether we should consider this to be terrorism is strong enough. So what we did is we actually had a different study that we were about to start data collection on nationally, on on, I think, like October 3rd of 2017. We ended up pushing that for a couple of weeks and then adding some questions in about the Las Vegas shooting. One of the most interesting ones is just simply asking people at this point in time, while the investigation is still ongoing, where there's still a lot of ambiguity about whether or not we should actually consider this terrorism, we asked people, is this terrorism, yes or no? And tried to understand what are some of the what are some of the factors that influence whether a person, a member of the public, thinks it's terrorism or not. And the ones that stick out here is that people who consumed more cable television, cable news, were much more likely to say that it was terrorism. People who are more conservative, more Islamophobic, and older were less likely to say that it's terrorism. That again sort of is supporting this notion that not only does media coverage have an influence here potentially in how people are perceiving violence, but there's also other sort of larger societal factors that might be influencing what people view to be terrorism or not in a way that's really problematic, because we can debate whether or not this particular incident is terrorism, whereas a lot of what Dr. Windich just talked about very clearly is and fits our definitions of terrorism, extremism, but it's not resonant necessarily with the way that members of the public perceive that. In probably one of the more depressing studies that I've conducted, which is really saying something as a terrorism researcher, this is an experiment that we were trying to see if the ways that we frame information could get members of the public to update their views on terrorism to be more in line with what data actually show. So we had participants, they read a short a press release, on data about terrorism in the United States in the 10 years prior to when we collected data on this. And a couple things that we varied in this is whether the source of this press release was a Democratic congressperson, a Republican congressperson, an academic, or we just didn't say who the source was. And then whether we just provided some numbers or we provided the numbers and details. So instead of saying, 12.5% of attacks during this time period were perpetrated by Islamist extremists, and leave it at that, add in some examples you might be familiar with and I have in a couple of cases. What we found here is that we asked people about how accurate they thought that statement was. People were more likely to say that the statement was accurate when their political identity matched that of the source, when the source was an academic, and when we provided them with some more details about the data. What's depressing about this, though, is that before we showed people the factual information, we asked them to estimate how many terror attacks there had been in the United States during that 10-year period and how many people had been killed as a result of those attacks. After they read this factual information, even though people tended to say it was pretty accurate, when asked after that, here's what you said before, do you want to update your views now? Most people did not want to do that. So it's it sounds like you're right, but I'm still going to hold on to my preconceived views about what extremism is, which is problematic, again, for how do we think about actually addressing these issues in a more holistic way. So why does this matter? So in general, looking at media coverage and perceptions of terrorism, as noted, Muslim perpetrated attacks are receiving far more coverage. That coverage is far more likely to describe the incident as terrorism, which can further these public associations between terrorism, extremism, and Muslims. This is, influences misplaced views on and fear of terrorism threats, and can promote prejudice and hinder security policy. As it relates to something like the January 6th incident, is where we see in real time playing out the hesitancy to label some of the acts that occurred that day as terrorism. And this is where it's massively complicated because, yes, some of the people who attended a protest were attending a protest as is their First Amendment right. The challenge, though, is that those who broke the law, and many of the people who were there did, how do we label this violence as being both part of a protest and acts of terrorism and potentially insurgency and riots, and that there's these multiple different labels that can and should be applied. But that is a complicated story that doesn't reflect the general way that terrorism is understood in the United States, or really in the world in general, is that people tend to like clearer stories. In the reality, this is really, really complicated. some of the ways that that this matters as well is that it challenges our understanding of how do we address terrorism and targeted violence domestically. How do we think about and understand and address the insider threats, like what Dr. Scharbeck mentioned with law enforcement and military, what Dr. Winch was talking about, where these far-right groups, it has been their MO to sort of mainstream and potentially infiltrate the power structures within society. So how do we address this? How do we process those who are involved in criminal actions? And hopefully, how do we take lessons that are learned from, it's particularly regarding civil rights and civil liberties post 9/11, and how do we apply this in a way that is not making our response counterproductive, as was the case, unfortunately, in many of the responses post 9/11. And that is what I had for today. So now I need to figure out how to get out of this.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Erin. I really liked how your presentation kind of supplemented Stephen's, where we talked about the problem, but then also the media's response and the way that people view terrorism. So it sounds like we have, number one, a problem with domestic terrorism and far-right extremism on its face, but then number two, how the media reports on it, and then how individual citizens perceive whether or not something is terrorism versus not. And the thing that I really found interesting about that asking people about the Las Vegas shooting, is that conservatives were less likely to view that shooting as an act of terrorism. And it kind of speaks to a broader issue in that population demographics, age, race, ethnicity, education, political affiliation influence the way that we see the world. That liberals and conservatives view policing matters completely differently. We view police use of force. We view whether or not policing is dangerous as a profession versus not. And there are stark differences across political affiliation in how we tend to view these events throughout the world. And it's pretty crazy. So thank you for that presentation. I guess we'll open it up now to kind of this panel discussion. And for those of you who have questions, don't hesitate to type in your question in the chat box. But I guess one where we could start is number one, where are the best data sources for counting or tracking domestic terrorism and hate crimes in the U.S.? Do we have a best data source? So I guess I'll open that, and you guys could take those questions.
Sure. So I was looking across ideologies. The Global Terrorism Database that I referenced is, the most comprehensive publicly available data set on terrorism. I mean, this is something that you can just Google Global Terrorism Database, and you can go poke around in it, different search parameters, and see what these data look like. Like anything, it is not perfect, and there's different, there's varying ways that we can define terrorism. I joke that if you had 10 terrorism researchers in a room, you'd get at least 20 different definitions of terrorism. And this doesn't mean that we don't know what we're talking about. It's that we're quibbling over tiny little things like the difference between civilian targets and non-combatant targets, which is like the USS Cole attack, where it's Navy, but they're on a training mission. Does an attack against armed, naval officers who aren't engaged in combat, does that count as terrorism? So it's minutia like that. But the GTD does allow you to change your search parameters. In terms of hate crime data, it's not good. I mean, the Unified Crime Report from the FBI has hate crime data, but there are known biases in this because it relies on law enforcement, the way that law enforcement report incidents. So if you look at the hate crimes data in the UCR, it would appear that there are, wildly disproportionate numbers of hate crimes in California, but it's more a function of how those are actually reported. And then no hate crimes really in Alabama. And you're like, that doesn't, that just, the sentiment resonance there doesn't quite match. So it's challenging.
Yeah, I hate when people report on the rise in hate crimes over time. And we saw it, people had a field day reporting that there was a rise in hate crimes during the Trump administration, when in reality, more and more departments were simply reporting them. And there was a little bit more consistency in how varying agencies and how varying states report those things. And of course, we're seeing it now with the rise in what appears to be anti-Asian hate crimes. But in reality, we have wildly different definitions, wildly different reporting standards, and it's almost impossible to state with any confidence whether or not hate crimes are rising or falling. So it is problematic due to a lack of a data infrastructure. Stephen, did you want to add to anything about?
Yeah, I would just say, the beauty of our country is we do live in a society that you're innocent until proven guilty. And so the criminal justice system has to work itself out. And so, as Dr. Carnes said, we have to track that hate crime that occurred from the initial reporting, if it's reported, because surprisingly, there's a lot of people that don't realize that they have been victims of hate crimes, and what just happened to them is a crime. But from that initial reporting, through the prosecutor, through the courts, through sentencing, there's plea bargains, there's all different situations where an official hate crime never actually hits the books as a hate crime. And so, yeah, you have to take everything with a grain of salt. And then every state, not all 50 states have hate crime laws. We have federal hate crime laws. But I think Georgia just this last year passed hate crime legislation. So you might not have every state have the same protected groups like gender identity, sexual orientation, where some, will include political affiliation. So it's just, there's a lot of kind of ebbs and flows from state to state. So there's a lot of disparity.
Yeah, in the wake of Ahmaud Arbery, Georgia still had not had a hate crime statute, which was, I think they were one of a few that still had not had any type of hate crime statute.
So they brought federal charges against them, right?
Right, within the last few days. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's, I guess, another question that I have, are there any similarities between pathways to radicalization for Islamic terrorist groups and far-right ideologies? Do we have any research on that? Are there similarities? Are there differences? Do people take the same kind of pathways, or are there differences?
Well, so Pete Simi and Kathy Blee, Matthew Day Michel, they collected data on this in 2015-16, where they took 10 right-wing extremists, 10 left-wing extremists, and then 10 jihadi extremists or Salafist-inspired extremists, and kind of did life history interviews and kind of plotted out some of the trajectories. The push and pull factors are very similar. And what we mean by push and pull are, what are these adverse experiences in your environment that are pushing you into extremism? They could be adversity, economic distress, unemployment, personal relationships. So these are pushing you into the movement. And then you have these pull factors that are within the movement that are kind of alluring. So camaraderie, belonging, acceptance, protection, opportunities to make money. And so initially, preliminarily, we are seeing a lot of similarities in terms of the push and the pull factors. But we do know that it is a gradual process, that radicalization it's fits and starts. You might start reading a lot and become indoctrinated, and then you're holding extremist beliefs, but you may not necessarily have extremist action just yet. And so that process does unfold over, a decent amount of time. And so there are similarities in terms of the push and pull factors, and then just kind of the general time frame of it that we found.
Aaron, anything for those pathways?
I think that Stephen did a really thorough job talking about this. And one of the things that I think is interesting is, looking at the difference between extremist ideology and action is this is where we also, in talking sort of about the civil liberties and civil rights protections here, is that, we're allowed to kind of think whatever we want. It's really thinking about how do we jump and understand who jumps from the holding these extreme beliefs to engaging in extreme action. And that's a really challenging sort of that mobilization piece is a really challenging piece to understand, because many, many, many people in society, have a particular view. Very few take action in support of that, and what does it mean to take action? These are really, I mean, there's just a lot that we really still need to dig into in this.
Yeah. At what point do we allow people to think what they want? And at what point does it turn into something that can be combated when it turns into actual behavior and action? So I guess another question that kind of dovetails with that is you have these, the Social Dilemma on Netflix and a bunch of different QAnon docs. Most recently I watched Into the Storm, which was awesome on HBO. What role does social media sites and this idea of anonymous posting on 4chan and 8chan and Reddit, what role do those play in both distributing these ideas and I guess subsequently, what role can these social media sites play in combating hate speech? So how do we balance, combating hate speech with also protecting people's First Amendment rights? Is that where we're kind of running into the difficulty here, trying to weigh, those two vitally important, things on either side?
Yes, it's a great and really complicated question. I mean, so the way that, just social media or technology in general, and one of the biggest influences I think it has is that it has the ability to connect people who already had perhaps some, predisposed leaning towards a particular viewpoint where, 20, 30 years ago, if it's a small subset of the population, you just you're not likely to be in the same place to be able to have those conversations. But the internet sort of allows you to have just these conversations and share information with like-minded people all around the globe. It also, we see this, in a lot of the discussion about, Facebook, a handful of years ago about, the siloing of information, the curated news feeds, that it's this echo chamber, and that anyone can share anything on the internet. And when we think about just the veracity of information, the way that information is, how things are framed in actual news media sites, but how that sort of spins out in more and more and more biased ways as you get sort of less and less, or lower and lower down the sort of news quality ladder, if you will, and that that there's just so many opportunities for misinformation and disinformation to be shared and not vetted, and particularly when it's in these echo chambers, and it is the misinformation or disinformation is feeding your preconceived notion. You're more likely to have confirmation and disconfirmation bias. You're less critical of things that align with your preconceived views, and you're more likely to dismiss evidence to the contrary. I mean, this is an experience that I had, and I would guess that Dr. Windich had, and most of the people who study these things have, is that in the aftermath of the January 6th attack on the Capitol, that floating around Facebook is like that it was Antifa. And you're like, no, like we can actually just look at the people in these pictures and tell you their names. They're really easily identifiable. Like we know who these people are. This is not a secret. But trying to have that conversation with even people who I've known for decades, it's really, really challenging, because it's my expertise in this doesn't matter as much as supporting someone's preconceived notions, and that's really challenging.
And I can pick up on the back end of that. So one of the projects that I'm currently working on is looking at online hate speech interventions, and this is interventions, diversity training have been kind of relatively established in person. So whether this is at school or in a workplace or a professional, job or whatever it is, sitting down with an instructor, kind of taking you through a dialogue in a class, diversity training, understanding, historic racism and disadvantage. Those things are effective. And we have found that that in-person training can be effective for reducing hate speech and bigotry. Moving that online has been a challenge. And the systematic review that we're doing, we found less than 20 studies that have actually examined this. So for those of you that are in the audience that are aspiring researchers and are looking for a new research agenda, looking at online interventions and testing their effectiveness is the next wave. It's like the next frontier. And so One of the things that we have preliminarily found is one of the big factors is the legitimacy of the messenger. It's hard to have the U.S. government telling extremists not to be racist, because that's the exact person that is the man, right? It's the enemy. And so having Life After Hate, Parents for Peace, different Exit Sweden, Exit USA programs, Exit Australia, that are having formers speak, having people that have been involved in these groups say, hey, I've been a part of this. I know what it's like. I have been there firsthand. That, I think, can be an effective messenger and have a sense of authority and a sense of authenticity to it that it may make the difference. But there is so much unknown about online messaging and counter messaging and countering these extremist belief systems.
It seems like it's pretty wide open in terms of, you know, figuring out ways to kind of combat this, and whether or not, you know, these private companies like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, whether or not they should be held accountable to kind of police or patrol what goes on their platforms. I guess we could go to some attendee questions. So this is from Ian Silver. Aaron and Stephen, great presentation. Aaron, I was just wondering if you have considered or examined if the observed relationships regarding media coverage has changed over time, considering societal and media changes that have occurred pre, during, and the post-Trump era. So has this media coverage changed over time? I guess long-term, and then, you know, short-term, post Trump.
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's something that we haven't actually looked at. So the data set that I was talking about was from 2006 to 2015. And that was just a function of when we collected the data. In early 2017 is when it started. That's just how many years of the GTD were out at that point in time. I would certainly expect stronger sort of polarization, not just in the overall trends, but, you know, if we had the ability, which we didn't here, to look at, say, Fox News versus MSNBC, and seeing that we'd probably see these stronger shifts post in the Trump era as well. In terms of actually looking at it, though, no, it's worthwhile to do for sure. I'll say that the data set that I presented on took thousands, literally, of hours of my time and research assistant time, my co-author's time, to just collect and clean the data. So the hindrance there is really just a function of having the time to really go through and look at this. But I think that, you know, again, future research for any aspiring researchers out there, that's, you know, definitely something that is worthwhile doing, that I just don't want to code news articles right now.
Yeah, it's definitely tedious, and that's what, you know, undergrad and graduate research assistants could help with. But then I'm a control freak, and I want to code it myself. Okay, cool. This question comes from John Sharp. The problem with labeling white supremacy as terrorism is that the majority of Americans are white and probably don't feel that it is a threat to them. You know, they're attaching themselves to a major political party has also made this more confusing. We also saw this in polls of whether Derek Chauvin was guilty. What can be done to overcome racial misperception of terrorism?
That's a tough one, because, you know, it's kind of like one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. It's, you know, it really is a matter of perspective, and to say like this one thing is terrorism is going to be hard to do, you know. And I agree with the sentiment that terrorism is definitely considered a foreign problem, and that it happens over there being the Middle East, and that somehow the United States is immune to radicalization, you know. And just the notion of homegrown violent extremism, like that term, homegrown violent extremism, implies that terrorism is homegrown in their home, outside of the United States. It's homegrown, it's imported. So terrorism is considered to be this imported issue. It's not something that domestically rises. And, you know, what we've seen in the last 6 months or so, I think totally debunks that we do have a radicalization problem, and that this is something that, you know, is happening in a country that, you know, John accurately described as predominantly white. And so I think doing what we're doing, more of it, more awareness of these groups, more awareness of these issues, and and what they truly stand for, not just the front stage projection, which is what they want us to say. It's interesting with the news coverage will recycle their own label of white nationalist. They called themselves white nationalists. They want that label to be out there, but they're actually white supremacists. And I actually heard Chuck Todd call them white supremacists for the first time like 2 weekends ago on Meet the Press, and actually use the term white supremacy, when before he's been using white nationalism, like a lot of kind of talking political pundits and stuff. So I think more of that, more calling it what it is, will be a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think that, there's a need for this more historical reckoning with the history of terrorism and, political violence in the United States since before we were even a country. And this is something, I think about when I move into the domestic terrorism section of my terrorism class. It is delivered with incredible sort of thought and how I sequence events, because it is something that I know is going to get pushback from students, because it is really, people don't want to think about the racist history of the United States the way that many pieces of this white supremacy is baked into a lot of our collective history. And, for most white Americans, this is something particularly that is like, well, but I'm not, so this isn't a problem that I have to. And it's like, no, this is a historical problem. And, thinking about, I found out fairly recently that my great grandparents were members of the Klan. That's probably not that actually different than most white people who are from the region of the country that I am from. I take pleasure in knowing that they would absolutely hate me, but thinking about really grappling with these historical issues in the United States and how it isn't just somebody else's problem is really challenging.
Yeah, I kind of experienced the same thing trying to talk about the historical context of police-Black community relations in the U.S. And it's scary to even put yourself out there in that space and talk about how, there was a lot of police who did not investigate racial terror lynchings, of which there were over, I think, 4,000 from the end of Reconstruction through the 1950s. It makes people uncomfortable. We don't have a true history of what happened in this country, thanks in part to, a failing, I guess, on the part of, the public school system, or just the school system in America in general. So it is hard getting people to recognize basic facts of our history. So I see that challenge in the realm of terrorism. Another question comes from Mikkel Dack. He's directing it towards Aaron. Before 9/11, American conceptions of terrorism were not necessarily oriented around Muslims. Instead, we deferred largely to the UN definition, which focused on hostage takings and assassinations. Do you believe that Americans and the media have the capacity to again reformulate or expand the popular interpretation of terrorism, even if it takes years?
I have to believe that is possible, or else the entirety of my career will be wasted. And you think about, so obviously 9/11 was this huge formative event in conceptions of what terrorism is that has influenced all of us for the last 20 years, has influenced the study of this, this field of study. I highly doubt that had that not occurred, I don't think that I would be studying this. I don't know if Dr. Winters would be studying this particular subject. Is the awareness of terrorism has and the study of terrorism, counterterrorism, has certainly taken off post 9/11. My hope is that as we get better data, better understandings of the breadth of this threat, that we can sort of pull back some of that in-group, out-group, the threats come from outside understanding, and have a more responsible and more accurate way of discussing terrorism in public discourse, amongst media, and in our policy responses to it. And I think that we have seen some shifts in this more recently, and I hope that is a more continued trend.
Stephen, do you have anything to add about this definition of terrorism and the evolution of the term over time?
No, I think Aaron did a great job of that. I would reiterate that, like, we all have to have faith in this, or else we wouldn't be doing this research. I totally agree with that. Absolutely. Yeah, it's all part of the process. It's all part of the journey.
Yeah. I want to take this time now to hopefully invite one of my colleagues, Dr. Lewandowski. She had a few questions. Carla, did you want to unmute and ask your questions?
So I'll try to give you, I think, what might be an easier question to just start with is, do you think our bigger threat is from a lone wolf or someone who is more formally part of a far-right extremist group? I mean, we know there's a debate as to where the threat is coming from, at least with Islamic groups, but what do you think of in the domestic sphere?
Well, I personally try to separate the lone wolf from the organizations. I mean, even somebody like Timothy McVeigh, Dylan Roof, Eric Rudolph, what we consider to be, lone wolf offenders, like, there's still links and associations. Like, what Timothy McVeigh did in Oklahoma City was already planned out by Covenant Sword Arm of the Lord. Like, they had those plans, that exact same blueprint, even down to using the Ryder truck. So it's hard for me to see these as separate entities. I think that obviously a lone offender is going to be a little bit more mobile, is going to be under the radar, is going to be able to kind of move more efficiently. But what they don't have is the resources. So I think there's always an ebb and flow and a give and take, where a lone offender is going to struggle to do things on his or her own without the support of the group. But they're going to be more efficient in doing it if they do have the resources.
Yeah, I mean, I also I don't love the term lone wolf or lone offender, I think in part because, especially in today's connected society, I find it hard to believe that anyone's actually lone acting in any way, shape, or form. And like that terminology, I'm afraid, might almost like glamorize those offenders in a way that doesn't help actual counterterrorism efforts.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much. I've actually talked a lot about that glamorizing in my own class as well. And we've actually also discussed the fact that lone wolves, I mean, how are you a lone wolf when you get so much inspiration from the internet? So, but thank you very much. And I'll just ask one more question, and then that way John can take it back to the comments. So right now we don't have a list of domestic terrorist groups, unlike the Department of State list of foreign terrorist organizations. And do you guys think we need one, or should we even have one? Or is it even possible?
Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah. So I prefer to label the action, not the actor. So I think where we get into like this discussion, okay, so like ISIS is a terrorist group, right? But okay, but that's not all that they do. They also are a proto-state that has engaged in insurgency and state building capacity. There's, the reductivist description of foreign terrorist organizations as terrorist organizations really minimizes a lot of the nuance of what they're engaging in and this complexity. And I think the same applies in the domestic space as well, where, I mean, you're allowed to have extreme views. It's more about the actions taken than I fear that if we try to police thought, it's going to have negative, it's going to be counterproductive and have even stronger ramifications and push people, it supports the state as the bad guy narrative, which then can just pull people even further into extremist views and actions.
Almost like having a backfire effect, huh?
Yes, exactly. That's the word I was looking for, and I couldn't get it. So I was just kind of describing around it. Thank you.
So does the Southern Poverty Law Center, do they have like the most exhaustive list of like, I guess homegrown or like, American-based hate groups compared to, say, the Department of State or Homeland Security? And is that kind of similar to how we're relying on the Washington Post and the Guardian for, death in police custody compared to the federal government actually keeping more accurate track of those things?
So Stephen, if you want.
I'm not sure which one's more accurate. I know that the Southern Poverty Law Center does keep a pretty accurate tally of hate group trends over the years. I'm not sure if theirs is more or less accurate than the federal government. But I do think that the comment that was, or the question that was made, actually links up with John's comment in the Q&A, that social media reacting and kind of censoring ISIS propaganda and Al Qaeda versus like the Proud Boys and the KKK. I do think having that foreign terrorist organization designation does allow the government to use all the tools in the toolkit, if you will. If a U.S. citizen is tweeting, retweeting, financially supporting a foreign terrorist organization, they have a lot more at their disposal to investigate that individual and kind of pursue action. Whether that's over the line, is another discussion. We've got a whole semester on like the Patriot Act and our different rights. But not having that domestic terrorist organization list and having them listed on there kind of provides some protection of sorts. I know we do have terrorist threats. We have a terrorist threat list, but the foreign terrorist organization list that the CIA has allows for a lot more action than what we currently have at our disposal right now.
I think, even to your point, I've talked about the fact that I think it could be weaponized by whoever is in power. So, for a foreign terrorist organization list, as you said, you can use certain tools against them. And if it were also a domestic list, then whoever makes up that list, whether it is the president or, Department of State, they could put, say, Antifa on there or whatnot, and then start using tools against those specific groups. And so I think it is scarier to have a domestic terrorist list personally.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. I'm not advocating for that list. It's more of, as you know, just what that opens up for you to use at your disposal.
Okay. I guess, we have a few minutes left. I guess I'll, unless, Carla, did you have any more questions?
I had one more question. So in the past, we've been somewhat protected from these far-right groups because they didn't combine forces. But it seemed like with January 6th, we really saw them finally come together. And so do you guys think that they will continue to come together and become an even greater threat? Or, I even saw recently that like Enrique Terrario was the Proud Boys leader. I think he was arrested, and so that kind of broke down a little bit. But, how much are we going to start seeing them really start forming bonds among the different ideologies within the far right?
Well, I can speak from the interviews that we've conducted. There's been a lot of what we're labeling as bridge building efforts. And so historically, your street-oriented P9, Public Enemy Number One, Nazi lowriders, Aryan Brotherhood, they've been considered to be like needle Nazis, right? Like street drug use, a lot of criminal activity. And then you have like your McVeighs, your Rudolphs, the terrorist side of it, and then your conformists, which would be like your David Dukes, your Richard Spencers. Within each of those, there's kind of these internal rifts about who's doing the most appropriate or the most efficient way of mainstreaming the movement or making progress. And so there is these internal fissures, if you will. But there's also these bridge building efforts that are taking place where conformists will say, hey, we don't like the Aryan Brotherhood. We don't like what they stand for. They're a prison gang. They're into drugs. But they raise a lot of money for the movement. So we can overlook that part, Or a conformist is saying, I don't want to blow up a building, but it does help, to fight our enemy if our back's against the wall. And so I don't know if you'll necessarily see a public unification of that, but I definitely think those back channels of like, we can't stand and say we like what you're doing, but we'll definitely take the money that you're feeding into the organization or the weapons or the membership. So I definitely see that moving in the future.
And I think that also opens up some avenues from a countering these bridge building, is that we can see this from other outside of the U.S. contexts where you have a bunch of different actors that are operating for the same broader cause, but taking very different approaches to how they do it with sort of perhaps looser affiliations or collaborations with one another. That also really opens up the opportunity from a counterterrorism side of things to exploit any of those rifts and sort of pit them against each other in a way that can potentially be beneficial.
100%. Yeah, like exploit those fissures, right, and get them to internally implode. 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't get that. Could you try?
My Apple Watch activated for some reason.
Okay. I guess we have time for one last question, something that I'm particularly interested in as a policing researcher. What is the connection between far-right ideology and current/former military and police officers? So I kind of brought that up in my introductory remarks. It's kind of alarming to see the level of current. It's mostly former, it's more former than current, but, just people who have that type of background in the military and in law enforcement. Is there a connection there why we're seeing kind of like this overrepresentation? And if so, can you, I guess, speculate on what that connection is, if there is one?
So my research, I focus a lot on symbolic interactionism identity, and some of the things that we found, especially as it applies to former law enforcement and former military, it's a lot about identity. And so there's two groups. You have those that are involuntarily dismissed from the military or law enforcement, like they wanted to continue their career and it just didn't happen, which creates a lot of uncertainty for their future, a lot of patriotism, a lot of sense of duty. The movement becomes kind of this replacement of sorts of like, my identity is uncertain. I can exercise this patriotic identity within the confines of this. We saw this with Timothy McVeigh. We saw this with Richard Guthrie. Those are two known extremists that had military experience, were involuntarily removed, and then committed an act of terrorism within the far right. And then the second is very symbolic interactionism, and it's this notion of reflected appraisals. When they were in the military and the law enforcement, they were told that they were serving their country. They were heroes. They were, doing this noble and altruistic cause. And as they leave the military, that is not reflected back to them. And so that sense of duty, that sense of sacrifice, creates this mismatch. And so now the movement becomes another way of restoring that sense of identity and that reflective appraisal. So my perspective is very much from a symbolic interactionist perspective. There may be others, that maybe Aaron can speak to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think we just don't know much about this as sort of the base caveat here. There's also the question of how much of this is that this is a after military or law enforcement service, these views versus those views already existed, and either they were part of these people were part of extremist groups who were the mainstreaming and purposefully joining law enforcement and the military, having those views prior, or at least having some predisposition to some of the socio-political sort of identity pieces such as social dominance orientation, right-wing authoritarianism. Those are some sort of socio-political perspectives or factors about individuals that predispose them to thinking that there should be a social hierarchy within society, predispose them to wanting to keep the status quo, and that those are things that we see are higher in law enforcement populations. Now, whether that is what attracts that people into law enforcement or what being part of law enforcement then fosters and builds those socio-political orientations has yet to be fully determined, but really sort of understanding these individual level characteristics as well.
Yeah, no, really interesting stuff. And I do believe that there is a solicitation from the Department of Homeland Security to study, law enforcement officers who, are extremists, which it seems like more and more people are at least becoming more aware of and wanting to study. You saw the creation of the Combating Extremism Working Group from the military. So it does seem like we're at least aware of these potential connections and moving forward, trying to better study and evaluate if there even is a problem, if one exists. So I think we're out of time. I want to thank the participants once again, Doctors Carnes and Windisch. Thank you all for attending. And it was a real pleasure to kind of have this discussion and talk more about domestic terrorism and far-right extremism through this lens of the January 6th insurrection. So just join me one last time in thanking the panelists, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.